We all think our own times are challenging, and yeah, they definitely can be. But human history is this long, sprawling story, and a whole lot of it is written in hardship. Today, we're not just looking at a few bad years. We're searching for the truly catastrophic, the period so soul-crushingly awful that just being born was like being handed a death sentence, or, if you were lucky, a life of unimaginable suffering. We're counting down the absolute worst times in history to be born. So, brace yourselves, because this journey into the past is going to be bleak. Coming in at number 10 is a tragedy that didn't unfold across the entire world, but within a single country. The scale, however, was so immense that tens of millions found themselves on the brink of survival. From 1959 to 1961, China experienced one of the most massive and hidden demographic collapses of the 20th century, a famine caused by the Great Leap Forward policy. This campaign, initiated by Mao Zedong, was meant to transform an agrarian country into an industrial superpower in just a few years. It began with the mass collectivization of villages. Peasants were forced into communes, made to give up their private plots, eat in communal kitchens, and work to the point of exhaustion. In their spare time, they were ordered to produce steel in backyard furnaces using scrap metal. Harvest results were artificially inflated to please party officials, while the real numbers were hidden. The state then seized grain according to these fictitious figures, leaving nothing for the people on the ground. The official line was, "The harvest is high, the people are fed," even as people were dying all around. Doctors were helpless. Medical care was non-existent. People were forced to work to the breaking point while severely malnourished. In several provinces, there were documented cases of cannibalism. Parents ate their dead children. There were even instances of families swapping infants so they wouldn't have to eat their own. At first, people ate tree bark, leaves, and grass. Then, they moved on to earth, clay, and waste. They boiled shoes, old clothes, and leather belts. The communal kitchens kept operating even without food, continuing to boil empty water with stones to maintain the illusion of a functioning system. Trying to take even a single grain from a field, even if it was the only thing you could give your child, could get you beaten to death or shot. Local authorities refused to acknowledge the famine. Complaints were treated as sabotage, and statistics were falsified. Fictitious successes continued to be reported up the chain of command. To this day, some archives remain partially sealed. Child mortality skyrocketed. Weakened, emaciated mothers couldn't breastfeed. Children were abandoned at the gates of party buildings in the hope of being saved, but no one took them. Those who survived grew up with severe consequences: stunted growth, impaired mental development, and chronic diseases. The famine primarily affected the rural heartland, which received no humanitarian aid, press attention, or international signals. It was a silent crisis, unknown both inside and outside the country. According to official Chinese data, about 15 million people died. Independent estimates range from 30 to 45 million. The real number is unknown. To be born in China between 1959 and 1961 meant entering a world where your parents' last bowl of rice could be taken to fulfill a quota, where the communal canteen might serve you boiled water with seaweed and call it a meal, where childhood began not with toys, but with hunger, cold, and the fear of being caught with a stolen grain of rice in your cheek. At number 9 on our list is an era that, for many, sounds too modern to be truly horrific. But from 1914 to 1945, humanity endured a chain of catastrophes that literally wiped out everything in their path. Yes, technology existed. Yes, doctors could do more than in the Middle Ages, but the scale of destruction had also grown. Imagine your childhood playing out against the backdrop of World War I. If you were a boy, you'd be raised from a young age with the expectation that you would one day find yourself in a trench, facing machine gun fire or a gas attack. Millions of soldiers were simply ground up in mud and lice, but civilians suffered too. Between 6 and 13 million non-combatants died in that conflict alone. But even when the guns fell silent, the nightmare wasn't over. The world hadn't even had a chance to recover when the Spanish flu pandemic struck in 1918. This wasn't just any flu. It targeted the young and healthy, and could kill a person in a matter of days. By the most conservative estimates, at least 50 million people died. Now, imagine being born in 1918. The war has just ended, but funeral processions line the streets, and quarantine signs are on every corner. In some countries, life expectancy plummeted. In the US, for instance, it dropped by a shocking 11.8 years in a single year. Those who survived this meat grinder got only a brief respite. The 1920s, especially in the US, are remembered as a time of economic boom, technological progress, and urban culture. They are called the Roaring Twenties for the explosive growth in commerce, construction, jazz, fashion, cars, and the illusion of endless prosperity. But this mostly applied to cities and the privileged classes. Beyond the shop windows and newspaper headlines, millions still lived in poverty, especially in rural areas. In 1929, it all came crashing down. The Great Depression began, the largest economic crisis of the 20th century. The Wall Street crash led to a collapse of the banking system. Businesses closed, unemployment soared, and international trade slowed to a crawl. Millions of people around the world were left without jobs, income, or food. Families lost their homes. People stood in lines for free bread and slept in tents and shacks. Those who had just yesterday felt part of a new era suddenly found themselves in a struggle for survival. Against this backdrop of desperation, radical ideas began to gain traction. More and more people listened to those who promised order, a strong hand, and national revival. And then came World War II, even more brutal, even more global. Blitzkriegs, firebombed cities, the Holocaust, millions dead, not just on the front lines, but in camps, in trains, in cellars. When the first atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it became clear. Humanity had learned to destroy itself on an industrial scale. By various estimates, by 1945, 70 to 85 million people were dead, almost 3% of the entire world population. To be born in the early 20th century, especially in Europe or Asia, meant walking through a continuous series of disasters. A childhood in war, a youth in a pandemic, young adulthood in an economic catastrophe, and your prime years in another, more terrifying slaughter. It was a time when progress and destruction marched hand in hand. At number 8, we have not an era spanning decades, but a single year. But what a year! A sharp, merciless, and global plunge into poverty, cold, and despair. 1816, infamously known as the year without a summer. Imagine being born into a world where the sun seems to have forgotten how to shine. The culprit was the eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia in April 1815. It was the most powerful volcanic eruption in documented history. So much ash and sulfur dioxide were thrown into the atmosphere that sunlight literally stopped reaching the Earth's surface. A volcanic winter descended, a sharp global cooling that struck the entire northern hemisphere in 1816. If you were born that year, your first summer was winter. In New England, for instance, there was snow in June, and frost was recorded in July and August. Across Europe and North America, crops failed one after another. Fields that should have been green and full of life stood frozen and empty. The price of grain skyrocketed. Food riots broke out in Britain and France. The cold itself could be deadly. Diseases related to hunger and malnutrition, like typhus, spread with terrifying speed. People ate anything they could find: cats, dogs, rats, boiled nettles, tree bark. Mass migration began as people tried to flee the famine-stricken regions, but not everyone was able to find refuge. Entire communities collapsed, barely holding on from complete ruin. And although the worst of it was in 1816, the problems with agriculture and food shortages continued for several more years. At number 7, we have two catastrophes that coincided in time and amplified each other's consequences. The 17th century was a time when Europe simultaneously faced a climate crisis and the longest, most destructive war in its history. The so-called Little Ice Age was a centuries-long period of cooling that lasted from about the 14th to the 19th century. But its most severe and devastating phase occurred in the first half of the 17th century. The cooling hit Central and Western Europe particularly hard. Winters became longer and colder, often with snowstorms and frozen rivers. Spring arrived late, and summers were short, damp, and often without sun. Crops rotted in the fields or failed to ripen. In the Alps, glaciers began to advance, flooding pastures and villages. In southern France and Italy, snow fell where it hadn't before. Peasant families lost their stores of food and couldn't feed themselves. Malnutrition weakened the body, lowered immunity, and diseases began to spread rapidly. People fell ill more often, recovered more slowly, and sometimes died from illnesses they would have otherwise survived. And parallel to this, the 30 Years' War began, a massive European conflict that engulfed much of Central Europe from 1618 to 1648. It all started with a religious dispute between Catholics and Protestants in the Holy Roman Empire, but it quickly escalated into a struggle for territory and political influence. Armies marched through villages, taking food, destroying homes, and leaving behind burned fields. Sides changed, borders shifted, soldiers looted, epidemics broke out, and famine spread. All of it came in waves, giving people no chance for a break. Some regions, like Bohemia, the Palatinate, and Mecklenburg, lost up to half their population. Even those who didn't die at the hands of soldiers often perished later, from dysentery, cholera, typhus, or simply starvation. People fled, hid in the forests, and abandoned their crops. Entire villages disappeared. Children were abandoned because there was nothing to feed them. In some places, parents gave their newborns to strangers, hoping that at least there they might find a piece of bread. The world a person was born into in the 1620s was unstable, dangerous, and hostile. Country, language, religion, nothing guaranteed protection. Even after the war ended, the economy took decades to recover. It was a generation that grew up on the brink of survival, in an era when both climate and man were equally destructive. The only hope was for a slightly milder winter, and that the next army would pass them by. At number 6, we land in one of history's most infamous and terrifying chapters, the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, this devastating pandemic of bubonic plague swept across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. It left behind a trail of millions dead and a deep crisis at every level of society. The disease was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis and was transmitted by fleas living on rats. Black rats were the main carriers of these fleas. The fleas became infected by feeding on the blood of an infected rat. Inside them, the bacteria multiplied rapidly, blocking their esophagus. When such a flea next bit a human, it couldn't swallow the blood and essentially regurgitated it back, along with the infection. Through the wound, the bacterium entered the bloodstream directly, causing a rapid onset of the disease. It reached Europe via trade routes from Central Asia. Once it took hold, it spread with terrifying speed and had a high mortality rate. Imagine, you've just been born, and all around you, people start falling ill. They develop a fever, chills, and their lymph nodes swell in the groin, armpits, or neck. Most die within just a few days. For an infant, the odds of survival were extremely low. If the mother caught the plague, she would likely die, and with her, the main source of care and food. If the whole family was struck down, there was no one left to even look after the baby. The disease made no distinctions. Entire households were wiped out. Villages were abandoned, the dead left unburied or thrown into mass graves. It's estimated that in Europe, anywhere from 30% to 60% of the population died. Some sources suggest 75 to 200 million deaths worldwide. This meant that in some communities, literally half the people you knew were just gone. The psychological consequences were severe. Fear and distrust were everywhere. People fled the cities, sometimes taking the disease with them. Others locked themselves away, hoping to escape infection. Social bonds weakened and broke down. Priests died alongside their parishioners, leaving the critically ill without last rites. Doctors, with no idea how the disease spread, were helpless and often became its victims. Some wore those bird-like masks filled with fragrant herbs, hoping to protect themselves from the foul air they believed caused the illness. For a child born at that time, the world around them was filled with anxiety, loss, and decay. The normal rhythm of life was shattered. It seemed as if the very air carried a threat. There were no methods of treatment or prevention. The sheer scale of death meant that basic social functions simply ceased. The few children who did manage to survive grew up in a different world, a world forever changed by the pandemic, where the memory of the great pestilence shaped their very perception of life and its fragility. Our fifth worst time to be born is the 13th century, an era completely overshadowed by the Mongol horsemen. Under leaders like Genghis Khan and his successors, the Mongol Empire launched conquests that were unparalleled in their speed, scale, and sheer brutality. To be born in a land targeted by the Mongols was to be born into a world of almost certain terror, destruction, and violence. Imagine, your community hears only whispers of an unstoppable army sweeping across the land, an army that moves like the wind and leaves only ashes behind. The Mongols weren't just conquerors, they often wiped out entire populations. Historians believe their campaigns may have killed tens of millions, possibly as much as 10% of the world's population at the time. Some estimates go as high as 30 to 40 million victims. If you were born in a city that decided to resist, your fate was practically sealed. The Mongols used psychological warfare. First, they offered terms of surrender. But if a city refused, obliteration. The entire population was systematically massacred. Contemporary accounts describe pyramids of skulls, rivers running red with blood, and landscapes littered with unburied bodies. Cities like Baghdad, a major center of Islamic learning and culture, were razed to the ground. Their libraries were burned. Hundreds of thousands of their people were slaughtered. The same happened across Persia, Central Asia, Rus, and China. Even if you survived the initial invasion, life ahead was filled with constant danger. For a child born into this chaos, the future was bleak. Your parents might be killed, your home burned, your community shattered. The Mongols often enslaved skilled artisans and young women, forcibly relocating them across their vast empire. Farmlands were destroyed, either deliberately or through neglect as people fled. This, of course, led to famine and more suffering. The sheer scale of the violence and destruction is hard to even comprehend. If you were born in Khwarazm or Kievan Rus during these invasions, fear would have been a part of your daily life. The very things that protect a child, family, community, stability, were all gone. Your earliest memories would have been accompanied by the sounds of clashing sabers, screams, and smoke. Simply surviving infancy would have been a miracle. And to grow up meant living among ruins, loss, and constant instability. It was a century where it seemed the four horsemen of the apocalypse themselves rode alongside the Mongol hordes. At number 4, we have a period that historians call one of the darkest in the entire history of Europe and the Mediterranean. It was a chain of interconnected events that began in 536 CE and stretched for nearly a decade. In the grim chronicles of that era, one can read of a sun that shone without brightness, a summer without heat, and cities where death arrived before the news. In 536, a dense veil of dust settled over the northern hemisphere. The Byzantine historian Procopius wrote that the sun became dim, as if in an eclipse, and so it remained for almost a whole year. Modern climatologists believe the cause was one or more powerful volcanic eruptions, likely in Iceland or North America. Colossal volumes of aerosols were released into the atmosphere, reflecting sunlight and lowering temperatures across the planet. The cooling was sharp. Average annual temperatures in Europe and Asia dropped by 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Celsius, a massive value by climatic standards. Crops failed, grains didn't ripen. Summer snow, droughts, and unpredictable downpours made agriculture impossible. People lost their crops, their livestock, their systems of trade, their trust in authority, and their sense of stability. But it didn't end there. In 541, 5 years after the climate disruptions began, an epidemic broke out in the Eastern Roman Empire, what would later be called the Plague of Justinian. The disease spread rapidly, engulfing coastal cities, ports, and trade routes. In Constantinople, according to chroniclers, thousands died daily. Modern data indicate this was one of the first documented outbreaks of bubonic plague caused by the same bacterium, Yersinia pestis. The combination of a climate catastrophe and an epidemic struck a blow to the entire structure of life. Agriculture, trade, the tax system, administration, everything stopped working as it should. Some cities became deserted. The economy sharply contracted. Emperor Justinian, despite his ambitions to restore the Roman Empire, was forced to redirect resources to fighting the epidemic and famine. State structures cracked under the strain. Unrest, impoverishment, religious panic, and a breakdown of the usual way of life gripped even those regions where the epidemic had not reached its peak. According to modern estimates, the plague of Justinian killed between 25 and 50 million people over several waves, and this was on top of an already weakened, hungry population. The period from 536 to 542 became a model of systemic crisis, a natural disaster, followed by a social one. And while most other eras of suffering were born from conflicts between people, here the initiator was the climate itself, and no one knew why the sun wasn't warm, why everything was collapsing, and how long this strange, cold silence from the sky would last. Third place on our list is not a natural disaster or an epidemic. It's the gradual but widespread destruction of complex societies. If you were born in one of the great cities of the Eastern Mediterranean in the 13th century BCE, you would have thought you were born in an age of order and prosperity. Caravans moved, temples were filled with offerings, and scribes kept accounts of grain and wine. The world was connected by trade and diplomacy. Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Mycenaean Greece, Ugarit, Assyria, these were all complex and developed societies, each with its own laws, bureaucracy, and writing. But by the time you grew up, most of these civilizations were gone. Around 1200 BCE, a chain reaction of collapse began, which historians would later call the Bronze Age collapse. Palaces burned, cities disappeared. In places where nobles had recently lived, now only hunters survived. The reasons remain a subject of debate. Droughts, earthquakes, invasions, internal rebellions. The severing of trade routes likely all at once. For those born during this time, it was not a single blow, but a series of them. Poverty, loss of support, and the disappearance of the familiar order. In Ugarit, a city on the coast of Syria, the last letters were sent just days before its destruction. The Hittite capital of Hattusa was deserted. In Greece, writing disappeared for centuries. Where ships once sailed with copper and grain, there was now silence. Children born in this period grew up without schools, without a stable harvest, without the certainty that there would be food or shelter tomorrow. It was especially hard in the transitional regions, where civilizations depended on foreign trade. Without metals, armies ceased to function. Without grain shipments, famine started on the outskirts and moved inward. What was once resolved through diplomacy was now resolved with weapons. Societies turned inward, losing their long-distance connections. Writing, music, architecture, everything either vanished or was reduced to a level of mere survival. To be born in this century meant entering a world where old institutions still existed, but were losing their meaning. No one explained what was happening because no one understood. The world was simply falling apart. In literally 1 or 2 generations, the Bronze Age ended, and a centuries-long Dark Age began. Now we venture much further back in time, to an era that makes our more recent calamities seem almost manageable. At number 2 is the period known as the Last Glacial Maximum, around 20,000 BCE. This wasn't just a bad year. It was an entire epoch when the planet was in the deepest freeze of an ice age. During this period, massive ice sheets, sometimes up to 2 miles thick, covered huge swaths of North America, Europe, and Asia. The average global temperature was about 6 degrees Celsius lower. Much of the planet was a frozen, windswept wasteland, an incredibly difficult environment for any life, let alone a newborn human. To be born then was to be born into a constant, desperate struggle for the absolute basics: food, warmth, and shelter. Resources were incredibly scarce. The herds of animals that humans hunted, mammoths, woolly rhinos, and other large mammals, were themselves struggling to survive. A failed hunt didn't just mean going hungry. It could mean starvation for the entire group. Life expectancy was brutally short. Making it to age 30 was a serious accomplishment. For a newborn, the dangers were immediate and relentless. The cold was a primary killer. Without proper animal skins and reliable shelter, an infant could die from hypothermia in a matter of hours. Malnutrition was a constant state for many. It weakened the body, stunted growth, and made children especially vulnerable. And that's not all. Humans back then were not at the top of the food chain. Cave lions, giant bears, and packs of dire wolves roamed these icy landscapes. For an infant, unable to defend itself or run, this meant a direct threat. The small, nomadic human groups had to be constantly on alert. There was no agriculture, no villages, no permanent homes. Only the endless search for food and shelter in a world that seemed actively trying to extinguish you. Every sunrise could be the last. Even a simple sprained ankle could be a death sentence if you couldn't keep up with the others. For an infant, completely dependent on the strength, skill, and luck of their small band, it was arguably one of the most perilous times to enter the world. The air was icy, the ground beneath was frozen, and the future held nothing but more cold and hunger. And now, we arrive at what many consider the single worst event, and therefore the worst time, to be born: the eruption of the Toba supervolcano around 74,000 years ago. This was an event so catastrophic it may have pushed our entire species to the very brink of extinction. Located in present-day Indonesia, when Toba blew, it was one of the largest volcanic eruptions of the last 2 million years. It ejected an almost incomprehensible amount of ash and debris into the atmosphere, over 2,800 cubic kilometers. That would be enough to cover the entire United States. The immediate aftermath would have been apocalyptic for anyone living nearby. But it was the global consequences that made this a truly terrible time to be born, no matter where on Earth you were. The eruption triggered a volcanic winter of terrifying severity, a sharp and prolonged cooling that, according to some estimates, lasted from 6 to 10 years. Sunlight was almost completely blocked from penetrating the atmosphere. Global temperatures may have plummeted by as much as 15 degrees Celsius in some regions. Plants withered on a continental scale. Animals, deprived of food, died out. Entire ecosystems collapsed one after another. For the small populations of early humans scattered across Africa, Asia, and perhaps Europe, this was an existential crisis. Food supplies, already a daily challenge, now vanished almost completely. The animals they hunted starved, and so did the humans. Genetic evidence suggests that the human population may have plummeted to as few as a few thousand individuals, perhaps only 1,000 to 10,000 breeding pairs. Scientists call this a genetic bottleneck, a moment when our species came terrifyingly close to disappearing altogether. If you were born during this period and you survived, you were part of a tiny, fragile remnant on which the future of human history depended. The world you grew up in would have been cold, hungry, and dangerous. The air would be thick with fine volcanic ash, making breathing difficult and likely causing health problems for years. Rivers may have dried up or become poisoned. Traditional hunting grounds would be barren. The daily struggle for survival would have been almost unimaginably intense. Every mouthful of food, every spark of fire, would have been a massive victory. To be born during the Toba catastrophe meant spending your first years in a literal battle for the existence of the entire human race. These are just a few of the truly terrible times our ancestors somehow managed to endure. It's a reminder of how fortunate many of us are to be born in an era of relative stability and abundance. It's amazing what a person can go through to survive. But so much of life depended on the year you were born. And that roll of the dice could easily mean not a life of opportunity, but one of suffering that bordered on the unbearable. What do you think? Are there any other historical periods you would definitely not want to be born in? Did we miss anything? If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next videos. And be sure to check out our other videos where we explore the most mysterious and dark pages of history.